In order to hard carry games, you have to have godly positioning. And while it's an incredibly complex topic, I summed it up in 10 core principles, 1 through 10 from basic to advanced, that you can incorporate in your games to have the best positioning possible, meaning that you'll be more overall effective, die less, and carry games more. So we're going to break it all down, but do me a huge solid and smash that like and subscribe button. And check me out right now live on stream and ask me a question about how to climb with your main, and let's jump into it. Now, the first thing that we need to talk about is the bread and butter of positioning: natural cover. Now, this could be any physical structure on the map that you can hide from enemies' abilities, line of sight, damage, and it's incredibly important because you want to be able to dictate the terms of an engagement. If you're peeking an enemy, you want to be able to do it when you want to, and not when you're not actively trying to shoot them, heal, make a play, or take space. On top of that, even characters that can reside further away from natural cover because they have mobility still want to be able to use a cover to dip away from the enemy temporarily while they get back their health, their cooldowns, and they set the next terms of engagement. Natural cover is the cornerstone for every single character's positioning in the game. And the thought exercise I always like to reference is, if there was a high noon or a diva bomb that just came out of nowhere, are you close enough to a natural cover source to get out before you inevitably die, no matter where the diva bomb or high noon is? Now, this leads into the high ground, which is incredibly important to understand just the advantages controlling and contesting the high ground gives you and your team. You get to look down on the enemy team, meaning that it's easier for you to get criticals and key cooldowns. It's a lot easier to nade someone like as Ana from the high ground to the low ground as opposed to the reverse. High ground allows you to use the ground or the floor as your form of cover, able to unpeak an enemy at a moment's notice, and you can always chase someone from the high ground to the low ground if you have a core advantage, and they can't easily chase you up to the high ground unless they're a mobility character, which is few and far between. Like, let's say you're fighting a Zarya as a cast, you're on the high ground. That Zarya isn't going to be able to just randomly chase you to the high ground if you start losing the matchup. Now, this means not only should you be defaulting to go to high grounds, after every single one fight, you should reclaim your defensive high ground if you're on defense, and on attack, it's your job to go and contest high ground points before you push the objective. And this goes double for tanks. Oftentimes, a tank wants to go straight to the objective, and this is a mistake when they really need to clear high ground, allowing some of their DPS and supports to take positioning on that high ground so that they have a vantage point over the fight on the objective that the tank eventually goes to. This seems counterintuitive because this will often look like a tank going to the high ground, clearing it or forcing enemy DPS off of it, and then dropping right down. But it's a very important discipline that you need to do every single game to allow your teammates to actually secure that high ground. Now, the last of the 3 basic positioning tips, we have effective range. And this is very important to understand that your positioning is going to be directly proportional to the ranges at which you are most effective as your character. Like a Widowmaker wants to take as long sightlines as possible, never allowing the enemy to be in their effective range, so it's a very hard time dealing with the Widow, while a character like Reaper is often looking for setups, high ground angles that they can drop on the opponent, and situations where they can close in that gap because that's where they are truly effective. In order to properly enforce this, you have to think about the disparity between your character's effective range and the opponent's. So let's take that Reaper example. If you're Cassidy, you want to play at a further effective range than the Reaper because he wants to play far closer to you and you want to keep your distance where he's not effective at all. But that same Cassidy positioning up against the Widowmaker could position far closer and more aggressive because the longer distance you create between the Widow, the better and better her matchup is because she has a further effective range than you. Now, moving on to more advanced topics for tips 4 through 10. First off, let's talk about repositioning on every single one of the roles. You got to understand that it's your job as a support, tank, or DPS to constantly be repositioning relative to certain factors that happen on the battlefield. If you're an Ana, for an example, you need to position pretty far away from your tank using your effective range, typically with some amount of cover and a high ground. But as the fight progresses, as enemies push closer, as you lose people, as any number of abilities are used, your positioning should not remain static. A position that was good, strong, away from the enemy, had good effective range, could change simply from an opponent pushing closer, and you have to constantly be repositioning, and if you don't do this enough, you could end up getting caught out by a rotating DPS or a rotating tank that is slowly creeping in to your quote-unquote safe area. Now, talking about other characters like tanks and DPS, you're going to look for advantages to put your opponents in an uncomfortable position, breaking some of the fundamentals that we talked about in the basic part, and looking for players that are also isolated and don't have the resources of their teammates to bail them out if they get put in an awkward position. Now, I do want to talk about hero differences in position because not every hero is going to position the same. Some heroes can position a lot different than others. And there's really three things that can differentiate. Mobility, effective range, and role are the three things that are going to come into play. So, as an example, a DPS's role is not necessarily the same as a tank's role or a support's role. And we talked about those differences before, but this is going to dramatically change the positioning that these characters occupy. And while a Zenyatta's role is to apply pressure using his effective range from afar, looking for key opportunities, but not necessarily going aggressive, trying to kill a ton of people in the enemy backline, he is not going to position anywhere near the same as a Tracer trying to go for solo picks in the backline. Not only is a Tracer's role different, but the effective range is different, and really importantly, the mobility is different on a Tracer. A Zenyatta could get easily punished for making a very aggressive flank, same way a Cass could, but characters like Tracer, characters like Genji or Soldier have the mobility in order to make these positions not as punishable, and that's a really important thing to keep in mind. Now, another core aspect that you need to understand about positioning is that there should be a push and pull depending on advantage. This is a really important concept, especially for tanks, but players often will not follow a tank when they press an advantage as well, which is something that you really need to do. So basically, when your team has some core advantage, typically numbers advantage, like you got to pick, you need to position more aggressively relative to that advantage. If you killed someone and you all remain passive, stay stationary, you miss the opportunity to force the team fight, to overwhelm the enemy that has less resources and wipe the enemy team, and you allow the enemy team's player to regroup. Now, this doesn't mean that you just W key straight at the enemy team in like a huge death ball, just running it down, because that could be giving up too many of your resources, putting yourself too out of position where you can get punished by the enemy team. But it does mean aggressively changing your position depending on how much advantage you accrue, and in the same vein, being more defensive the less and less advantages you have. So if you have a pick, 1-2 players down, it's your responsibility to back up, give space, position far more passively, conserve cooldowns, so that you can regroup and potentially fight at a full fighting force, and your positioning is going to change relative to your advantage or disadvantage, passive or aggressive. Now, I do want to talk about engagements, and this one's really important. How do you engage with proper positioning on dive, brawl, or poke? Now, this goes back to what we talked about, the effective range of these compositions. Poke wants to play from a further distance, brawl wants to try to take the fight in close, and dive wants to surgically target a specific character. But how do you do these engagements while still adhering to the positioning rules that are already set out in the beginning of the video? Well, you have to understand that it is also important that a position allows players to do their job and be effective. This is really important, and this is something that goes horribly wrong in a lot of these engagements with these compositions. So let's take a dive composition on Numbani, right? You have an Ana that is playing main, and you and your Tracer, your Winston, you have a Tracer, y'all jump right because the enemies are playing the high ground out of the line of sight of your Ana. Now, the Ana is in a really awkward situation where they can't really see you or help you, so you're engaging in a disadvantage. So we're really W king, but we're putting ourselves in like a 2v4 where our Ana is not in a position to help us. So how can we change that? What can we do? Well, we can try to set up the Ana's position in some place where she can actually help the dive. Maybe this means securing her the high ground, or wrapping her around the point to the bottom left side where she has line of sight on where the dive will end up. This concept is just about doing your due diligence to set up the pieces of the composition so that everyone can actually contribute it So a character like Ana can still potentially play with natural cover in their effective range where they can be efficient in the fight, but the characters that can break some of those rules because of their mobility can still go in and dive the high ground like they want to, because you wouldn't want to have to play high ground effective range of your Ana with like a Tracer Winston just like following the Ana to the high ground trying to contest places that they just can't play in. And this concept really allows you to understand that not every character needs to be playing the same position. In fact, this is often not the correct thing, but it's still important for you to help set up your teammates for their optimal position if you want your plays to go more smoothly. And this is true for a dive composition, potentially a brawl composition, or even a poke composition. Understand what you're trying to do and what you need to do to help your teammates get into their optimal position is the way that you're going to have the most successful engages. Now, the next thing that we need to talk about is abilities and ultimates. And this is something that can directly change how you should be positioning. If you know there's an ultimate coming up, how you should be positioning should not be staying the same, especially if it's a really impactful ultimate. Let me give you an example. If you're going up against a Shatter, you know the enemy Reinhardt has a Shatter, it's very, very easy for supports to play around this, for DPS to play around this, but most of the time, they don't. They still stack behind their tank. They play in the same position. And when that 3, 4, 5-man Shatter comes down, they basically just completely lose the fight. But it doesn't have to be that way. An Ana can play from distance. A Kiriko can play the high ground, saving her Suzu. A Lucio can be wall riding. A Zenyatta can play really far away. DPS can play off angles. The tank could be actively looking to counteract the Shatter with his positioning and cooldowns, or except that he will be the only one shattered, but his team are positioned in a way that prevent them from getting shattered as well. Basically, every single person can play differently or position differently around key ultimates, and the better you track ultimates and even abilities, the better you can position around these things when they come up. And this is another reason why game sense and positioning kind of connect so closely hand in hand. Now, the last but certainly not least thing that you need to understand in this video is the idea that you need to change your position dramatically depending on the enemy's composition. While Zen has a very far effective range, which you typically want to utilize against a lot of characters, like I would want to position very, very far away from characters like Cass. If I isolate myself and the enemy has multiple divers like Sombra and Tracer, then I won't be able to get the peel I need. And against some compositions, I can position really far away, but other compositions, I need to make sure that I'm really, really close to my team so that they can potentially peel me. And if you watch my other videos, you understand the concept of sandbagging abilities on a character like Ana up against a dive composition and being more liberal with your abilities up against something like a poke composition. Because if you get dove on as an Ana, you also want to have these abilities to use to counteract the dive, as opposed to you're not going to be pressured in the same way up against a poke. You're just going to be shot at from afar, which means that those things aren't going to be as heavily taxed and you don't need to sandbag them nearly as hard. The same concept also applies to positioning, where you are positioning either more reserved, which means you're closer to your team, you're more capable of getting abilities and peel from them, or you're playing more liberally with your position because you know that even if you're off alone in like an alternate angle in the backline trying to make a value play, you won't get pressured by a random Tracer or Sombra. And I really hope that the combination of these two concepts kind of mend in your mind and make you understand how you should be positioning and playing fundamentally different with your ability use and where you're standing, depending on every single aspect of your composition, the opponent's composition, your matchups, your mobility, your advantage, and it just kind of all lines up. But if you really have any questions about this, you definitely got to ask me down below on stream, in the description down below as well. Please smash that follow button, and I'll see you next time.